One of the key factors of a strong clinician. So when I hire clinicians, one thing I look for is professional humility, knowing that you don't know everything, because you're right, it's absolutely impossible. And professional integrity and professional humility are two things that we are not explicitly taught.
Hey there, you're listening to What the Frickative Podcast. If you're looking for an SLP podcast that is raw, unfiltered, and authentic, you've come to the right place. Join us as we chat about grad school survival, daily struggles and successes of an SLP, and stories from all of you. You'll be sure to laugh, learn, and maybe even cry, but that's okay. We're here to support each other through it all. And now, here is your host, Sam, from Speaking of Semantics.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on the What the Frickative podcast. Today, we have my lovely friend Kate here as a guest. She has probably been one of the first followers I had when I started Speaking of Semantics, and one of the most supportive friends I have. So Kate is going to talk a lot about continuing education, her private practice, and a lot of other fun stuff. Hi, Kate.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It is such a pleasure to be a guest on someone's podcast. This is super fun.
Yeah, Kate's going to talk about her own podcast too. But yeah, it is fun. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are outside of the speech world?
Who am I outside of the speech world? Well, I'm a Sagittarius. No, I'm just kidding. I've been a speech pathologist for, it feels like a million years. I graduated in 2007. So I have been in the SLP game for over 15 years. And outside of the speech pathology world, I'm a mom. I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. I live a very boring suburban life that I find very peaceful, but also resent because it's very boring. So sometimes feel very jealous of people who go on adventures and travel. But we live outside of Massachusetts, outside of Boston in Metro West Massachusetts. And I'm an avid knitter and I play the piano. Really? I am an avid knitter and I play the piano. Those are two random little facts that the world doesn't know about me.
Those are your two truths. Where's the lie?
Oh, I could come up with a lie. I don't know. I'd have to think. I love trampoline. I love trampolines. No, I don't.
Oh, fun. Yeah, I love Massachusetts. It's very cold there, though. So we have a lot of grad students that watch or listen to our podcast. So can you tell us a little about your grad school journey?
Sure. So I was in graduate school twice. So I have my master's in speech and communication sciences and disorders, and I also have a postgraduate certificate in behavior analysis. And my grad school journey for speech pathology was at Emerson College in Boston. And it was, generally speaking, a really good experience, mostly because I had a great cohort. There was not a lot of competition. I hear a lot of horror stories out there. I had a lot of support. We had a lot of groups studying. We had a lot of hand-holding and supporting one another through good times and bad times. And I made really good relationships with my professors, which is also, I am realizing and learning, can be a rarity. I've seen a lot of horror stories out there about the power differential between PhDs and clinicians and faculty and students. I was fortunate enough to not experience that. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite professors is now a board member for my company. He's on our advisory board. Amit, shout out to you. Wow. And I developed really great relationships with them. I find that my grad school experience, now that I've been practicing for 15 years, there is a lot that was left out of my education. And on the one hand, I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but on the one hand, I see that our institutions do as the best they can in terms of giving us as much information as we need to enter the workforce in a safe way, in a responsible way, and in a competent way. But on the other hand, our scope of competence or a scope of practice rather for speech language pathology is so immensely wide that it's almost an insurmountable task. It's almost impossible to really graduate feeling like you are competent to do the job. And it's a very intimidating process. I remember being terrified for my first client, terrified. I think I drank like a whole bottle of wine before I went to bed so that I could sleep because I was so anxious about it. I was a lot of fun when I was young. Those are stories for another time. But yeah, it was a good experience, but a very nerve-wracking one.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like how you brought that up, that there's a big gap between what we learn in graduate school and what we do on a daily in our clinical practice. And I like to say that a lot to graduate students because they have this feeling, and I'm not sure if it's created from graduate schools or just us as speech pathologists, the kind of people that we are, the need to know everything. And I'm like, you will never, ever, no matter if you're practicing for 1 year or 20 years, get to the point where you know everything. Because most of the time when we graduate grad school, we either go into some sort of niched part of speech pathology or we're doing pediatrics versus medical and all of that. And I'm sure you know this on a firsthand basis, but the evidence-based practice is consistently growing. There will never be a point where you know every single thing. And I always assure people or grad students that, because having that feeling of doom always in the distance of, well, there's one thing that I don't know, like it'll be fine. And I always like to ask practicing SLPs, do you think if you went back and took the praxis right now, would you pass?
No, I passed by 1 point. I got a 601. So I definitely wouldn't. But I want to touch on something that you just said because I think it's really important. One of the key factors of a strong clinician. So when I hire clinicians, one thing I look for is professional humility, knowing that you don't know everything, because you're right, it's absolutely impossible. And professional integrity and professional humility are two things that we are not explicitly taught.
Yeah.
And when you take on a new job or you take on a new client, you're always learning. And if you don't think you have anything to learn, if you aren't approaching a clinical scenario or a new job with curiosity and humility and acknowledging that you don't know anything, then you won't learn. That is an absolute game. It's a showstopper in terms of your openness and willingness to acquire new information. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're saying you're having any kind of underlying anxiety that you don't know everything, that's good. That is good because it means that you are open to learning. One of the things I say often to my staff and through interviews is I can teach you the skills.
Right.
I can teach you the skills. I can give you the information. I can give you the external evidence or the research. I can teach you how to take data and collect internal evidence. I can teach you counseling skills. What I can't teach you is humility. That is something that's a very personal experience. That's a very soul-searching experience. So if you are listening and you're young in the beginning of your career, really embracing components of humility, it's going to set you up for so much more success.
Yeah. And it's sad. I don't know if I would count it as sad, maybe, but that our grad application process doesn't count much of that into it. It's all numbers. Yeah. What's your GPA? What's your GRE score? What grade did you get in our speech classes? And it's to be a speech pathologist, yes, you need to be smart enough to gain all this knowledge and keep all this knowledge in our head, but you need to be a people person. You need to know how to speak to people, how to communicate with people, how to have empathy for people. We're dealing with a lot of people who are at their most vulnerable state in their lives. Yeah. And that's what you need. Those are the skills you need. And that's something that tests like the praxis or the GRE can never test.
And I also want to point out, you're saying a million brilliant, smart things. Our evidence-based practice triangle is 3 parts, right? Everybody always thinks of evidence-based practice as a research article. That's not what it is. It's a process. And it has 3 components. It's external evidence and internal evidence, so the evidence arm. It's the clinical judgment arm, but it's also client perspectives and values.
Yep.
If you can't approach a problem with professional humility, cultural humility, professional integrity, and acknowledge that you're not the expert, that someone else has something to bring to the table, then you are not going to be able to move through that problem centering the perspectives and values of your clients, which is the evidence-based practice component. It's the marriage of those things. And there's such an emphasis on the research in graduate school, such an emphasis on the science. And it's critically important. Don't get me wrong. 2 out of the 3 prongs, clinical judgment and evidence, are rooted in some of that factual knowledge, but it's not the whole pie. It's not the whole picture. We really have to look within ourselves and do that work and make sure that we have the space and the humility to center center the client perspectives and values for evidence-based practice. Yeah. Again, practice as a verb, not a noun.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as you were saying that, it made me think of all the people who struggled to get into grad school, the people who've had to work their butt off to get to where they are, the people who are taking care of their family members, the people who have kids, not the traditional students that just go from undergrad to graduate school, the people who have worked their butt off. Those are the people that have so many of those skills that we need for that third part of that evidence-based practice, but they are so heavily looked over in the grad application process because of all these numbers. I'm someone who, you can quote me as a traditional student. I went straight from kindergarten all the way through graduate school, didn't take a single year off, but I had the most mediocre grades. And I'm lucky that my graduate school took a chance on me and said, hey, because I had the opportunity to interview, I had the opportunity to show them, hey, this is who I am. These are the stories that I can bring. I have personal experience from my mom, from my brother, all of these things that grades from a test could never tell you. And I take all of that into my practice as a speech pathologist, and I can relate to people who have a tracheostomy tube and say, hey, my mom had one. I know exactly how you feel. What can I do to help you? Sometimes we're the first person to actually stand in front of the patient and say, what do you need? I'm not just going to be another person that walks into this room and says, hi, what's your name? What's the date? What else? And can you eat this? No, that's it. I'm going to ask you, how are you? Because I know how it feels both on the familial side and on the professional side for you to be sitting in a bed staring at me, feeling hopeless and helpless right now.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good point. And I've had the same experience becoming a parent. I think of the things that I used to ask parents to do. Now that I know what it's like to have two very energetic school age kids, I'm like, what was I doing? And that's part of it, is like looking back on yourself and learning that you made mistakes and being comfortable with those mistakes so that you can continue to grow and change and become a better clinician. It's always changing, always changing.
Yeah, I'm like devoted to get this whole perfectionism standard out of speech pathology because none of us will ever be there. We all make mistakes. I've laughed at a billion mistakes I made in grad school. I actually just made a TikTok the other day about how I walked into a patient's room who was NPO and I said, hey, what'd you have for lunch? And I still remember that to this day, and I'll never do it again because of that mistake. I've learned from it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good example. I'm sorry that happened to you. I've had 1,000,001 of those moments that I will keep most of them private, but yeah, it's a process. And I think one of the problems is that our systems, right? We're all working in broken systems, racist systems. Our systems are broken in general. And one of the issues with the speech pathology system, one among many, is that we work in the medical model. And where our field is based in the medical model meaning there is a person who has a problem and it needs to be fixed. And we are the experts to fix it, which is not a collaborative or person-centered model. So as we go through these graduate programs that are rooted in that model, we are taught, here's the information. Here is how you can be the expert to fix the problem. And that is often the flavor of what we experience in graduate school. I was lucky enough to have a counseling class in my graduate program, which I think a really wonderful experience. And for anybody who is out there, if you are in graduate school or looking at graduate schools and they don't have a counseling class, or they don't have any formal training in some of these softer components that are non-medical model, not based in a medical model, there are free resources out there that where you can go to consume some of this information. And I can give you some of the links to put in the show notes for where people can go for some free information.
Yeah. And I think this is a perfect segue to start talking about what continuing education courses are and why we need them as speech pathologists. Me, myself, my first 30 are due at the end of this year. And even me, thank God I have you with the SLP Nerdcast because I was just lost. I was just like, I don't know what I want to learn. There's just so much out there. I don't know what I have to do. There's so many rules around it, but also rules that people may not know about necessarily for gaining those continuing education units.
I'm happy I can talk about this for hours. I won't talk about it for hours. I'll make it brief. But so I'm gonna compartmentalize my answer into two parts. So the first part is, what are the requirements? So what do you have to get for CEUs to maintain your license? And the second part is why. Why should we care? What's the point? Why are we spending our money and our time? I really love to zoom out and ask those questions. Why? Why are you spending your money and your time? Because it's either time or money, always. So the first question, what's required? ASHA requires that you earn 30 professional development hours every 3 years. And some of those regulations have changed. Out of those 30 hours, you now also have to earn an ethics hour and a cultural competency hour. If you are supervising, you also need to earn specific supervision credits. Those 30 hours do not have to be ASHA CEUs. This is a really big area of confusion that we are not explicitly taught in graduate school. Since we've launched our platform, SLP Nerdcast, we have heard from multiple professors who did not know that this was a thing. And one of our missions is to spread this knowledge. ASHA requires 30 professional development hours, or PDHs. They used to be called CMHs. In case you ever hear that term, they're the same thing. But for now, 30 PDHs, professional development hours. The ASHA CEU is a branded unit of measurement. So a brand, Gucci, I don't know, think of another brand, Warby Parker, I don't know, a brand, right? It's a branded unit of education where a company or an ASHA provider, a company can petition ASHA and say, I would like to sell my courses as a branded ASHA CEU course. And we're ASHA CEU providers. I can talk all about that process. We have to pay ASHA a fee. So all public, all this information is available online, and read a whoppingly large manual. It's 170 some pages to learn how to make sure that our courses are up to a certain standard. And this is everything from very minutia things like a course title can't be more than 80 characters to things that actually matter, like making sure that your learners disclose their financial relationships before a course so that you know that the person's either trying to sell you something or whatever. So the ASHA CEU is a branded unit that is associated with the ASHA registry, which is something else that ASHA sells to make it convenient so that they'll track their CEUs for you. It's also associated with the ACE Award. So the ACE Award, I think it might be an acronym, and I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's essentially an award that ASHA gives individuals who have earned more than 30 hours of education in their certification maintenance cycle. The ACE Award is only available for ASHA CEUs. So these are all products. Think you go to a store, you buy branded products, right? These are products that are branded by ASHA that are available for sale. They're not required. They are not required. ASHA says that there are other activities that can count towards your professional development hours. I can make sure that you have a link to ASHA's website so that your listeners can take it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Generally speaking, the rules for what is required is that the person has to be a learner. You have to have, the content has to be related to your job in speech pathology, which could mean a lot of different things. And you have to be able to prove your attendance. So you need to be able to have a certificate of achievement or a certificate of attendance or a certificate of completion of whatever it is. A lot of people can get those hours and meet those requirements outside of what we think of as a typical webinar. A lot of hospitals will have rounds, for example. You could attend a training from an OT because you are working with a client who has some sensory seeking behaviors and you're looking for other strategies to better regulate them in your sessions. You could get training from a journal club. You could start a journal club and meet every month and have a third party validate your attendance. You could take a graduate course. You could take a postgraduate course at a university. All of these things count towards your 30 professional development hours. When you are, regardless of where you get your continuing education, you do have to petition to ASHA at the end of your 30-year cycle. So you'll have to, your 3-year cycle, you'll have to do this year, where you sign an attestation that says that you completed it. If you get audited and you didn't use the registry, you will need to keep your certificates on file. And you will need to mail them or scan or digitize them somehow, I believe, fill out a form and prove to them that you did your 30 hours. Does everyone get audited? No. How many people do they audit? I have no idea. But you could call the Action Center and I'm sure they would tell you. If you use the ASHA registry, they say that they audit the same number of people across both pools, but they validate it through the registry. So I'm not really sure what the technical components there are. But at the Nerdcast, we really feel like this misinformation prevents people from getting the knowledge that they need to do their jobs and be competent and provide high quality patient care. Yeah. And that's the point, right? So this is moving into that second category of why should we care? Why do we care about continuing education? We care about continuing education for a bunch of different reasons. First, it's related to ethics. So our ethical code in, I think, 3 different principles specifically calls out competency. How can you be competent in something if you don't know anything about it? So I'll give you a great example. I've been a practicing SLP for 15 years. I have only worked with AAC for the last 13 of those 15 years. If someone gave me a student, client, or patient who was looking for more support with dysphagia, I would not treat that patient in a million years. You couldn't pay me. I am no longer competent in that area. And I would need a lot of continuing education or mentorship or access to additional information to increase my competence to a point where I could ethically provide treatment. So ethics is a really big reason why we have continuing education. One of the principles in our ethical code is that we will be lifelong learners. So they basically state in the ethical code that we really do need to care about continuing education. Another component is this evidence-based practice triangle that I already mentioned, right? So we have clinical judgment and we have internal and external evidence. It's our jobs as we stay in the field to stay current. And what's the best? That's the continuing education is the main channel through which we do stay current. So what I learned in 2006 is not current. It's another reason why I would never treat most individuals outside of the very narrow scope of competence that I've developed over the years. We really do need to care about continuing education after graduate school, after our first 3-year cycle, because it's the main vein through which we remain competent, remain ethical, and continue to provide evidence-based practices, again, as a verb and not a noun. It's also our time and money. And this is like where we're like trying to really change the system. Not all continuing education is created equal. Remember, the goal is to improve your competence. Just staring at a webinar when you're getting like told about some research article that doesn't even apply to your caseload, is that knowledge going to help you provide better patient care? So I think it's really important for new grads or any speech pathologist, any licensed professional, to be really careful about the knowledge that they consume, making sure that you're not just ticking that first box of, oh, I got my 30 hours, but that you're acquiring knowledge that is helpful to you, that you can bring into your classrooms, that you can bring into your hospitals, that you can bring to your patients to make sure that your patient care is elevated. There is a crazy statistic. I'm going to blow your mind. We all talk about the research practice gap, right? Mm-hmm. This says one thing, but clinicians do another. Did you know there is a published statistic, that it takes 17 years for research to become common practice? 17 years.
That's
exactly.
A long time.
It's a really long time. And so earlier in this conversation, I mentioned one of the many problems in speech pathology, and this is one of them. So continuing education and consuming continuing education that's clinically relevant is another really important thing to be wary of, in making sure that as you're spending your time and money, because it's either time or money, it's one of those two things, you're consuming knowledge that is clinically applicable, that can actually help your patients, instead of just learning about some random study that, doesn't really help you, even if it's an ASHA CEU. And that's where I get a little cranky, because just because it's an ASHA CEU doesn't mean that it's knowledge that's helpful to you in your job.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. You just absolutely blew my mind. I didn't know any of that. I think that you need to go to every single graduate school and have a talk.
Well, you have your podcast. That's why we're talking about this.
Present this podcast, because I feel like if people knew that information out straight out of graduate school, it would be so different. I didn't know that stuff out of graduate school. I waited until the 3rd year to start my 30 hours. That's my type B brain, but also wasn't excited about it. I was just until
because it's more time and money. You just graduated, for crying out loud.
Exactly. And I think this is a prime example too. Like we were saying before, graduate school doesn't teach us everything. And I don't want to fully blame them, because they have a lot of things on their plate, but we have to fill those gaps. It is our job to fill those gaps in order to maintain our clinical competence. I've been doing the SLP test prep for graduate students, and I've gotten so many times, like I had one class on craniofacial abnormalities. I had one single day I had one single webinar on counseling. And yeah, all of those things are so important. You may go into them, you may not, but for those who do want to go into those 3 kind of niche topics of speech pathology, and that's exactly where they turn, these CEUs. And people need the knowledge to know that ASHA is there, yes, but also there are so many other resources, I found that especially after the pandemic, the world of speech pathology on social media and the knowledge that we've been sharing between each other has grown so much. So many people in like niche parts of speech pathology, I said, let me create a webinar so that people can learn more what a day-to-day basis looks like for a NICU SLP or for an SLP who deals only with AAC like you. When we think of SLPs, a lot of time we just think of school SLPs, that's it. But even school SLPs are dealing with so much more than they had to in the past.
Yeah.
80 kids on your caseload. 4 of those kids are AAC kids, and you've never had an AAC class in school. Well, now what?
Yeah. That's the problem, is that often, depending on your work setting, you're expected to treat what, quote, walks through the front door, right? Regardless of your scope of competence. And if you ever do find just talking to your listeners quickly, if you ever do find yourself in one of those positions, you can advocate to your superiors, to your supervisor with your ethical code and say, this is not ethical. I am operating unethically, treating this patient because I have zero experience, and advocate for additional resources. The hospital that I used to work in very early on in my career hired a mentor to teach me how to use AAC. She's the co-host of my podcast now, and I made her be my friend, and we bonded over snacks and science fiction books. But there are things that you can do to improve your scope of competence, and you can advocate. Just because you're a new grad does not mean that you know everything and that you can't advocate for yourself. It is an ethical issue to treat a patient for which it is out of your scope of competence. And you can still treat them with the right support. So asking your superiors to pay for continuing education, to pay for a mentor. Another problem, since we're just talking about all my complaints about in our field, is that we don't embrace mentorship. We don't have formal systems for mentorship. We don't have a lot of funding for mentorship. And if you have an employer who will support continuing education or gives you a stipend for continuing education, you can get ASHA CEUs or professional development hours for working with a mentor. It is a little known fact. It is called an independent study, and it happens. We process them often. So if you are finding yourself in that unfortunate, uncomfortable position where you're being asked to treat something that you don't feel comfortable, it is well within your right to advocate for those resources. And the resources aren't, to your point, they're not just a webinar. It can be a lot of additional support. And I would also say to be very wary of what's on the internet. So that 17-year gap, guess what it gets filled with? A bunch of crap. It gets filled with a bunch of noise, a bunch of opinions. And now that we're all more connected and learning is becoming more of a norm, there are some platforms that do not embrace a peer-reviewed process, that are not accredited by other governing bodies and publish information that isn't necessarily rooted in that external evidence. I've seen some things published on Instagram specifically that are just wrong, where I happen to know, okay, this person didn't even Google it. You could Google this information or this word and get the right answer. So knowing your source and knowing the credentials and what's the word I'm looking for? The counterbalance or accreditation. So if you're following a university and it's a research lab, chances are that's pretty good information because it's accredited by a dean. There's a whole system in place to make sure that what they're publishing is rooted in some sort of evidence. Very different than following a lifestyle account where the person is also maybe a teacher or maybe an SLP. They're just being very wary of where you consume your information is also really important.
Yeah, that leads me down so many different roads. I'm not really sure which road I'm going to take. But
I'm here. It's an adventure. Go for it.
That leads me to think of, yes, there are so many people, so many SLPs on Instagram. And while it's amazing most of the time, you have to take what you with a grain of salt for both reasons. Like you said, we don't know where that information is coming from. And 2, it also bleeds into the whole comparison game, which SLP grad students especially suffer from a lot. The whole kind of, they had a perfect therapy session and they posted on Instagram. And I was like, okay, what's behind that picture? There's so much more behind that picture. You never know what someone else is going through. Instagram is, take it with a grain of salt. Instagram is a highlight reel. People only show you what they want. And that's
not only that. Oh, I have so much to say. I could be here for hours and I won't dominate the airwaves and all of your time. But one of the things that somebody said something to me once, and I can't remember who it was, that totally changed my perspective about this perfectionism. We're a data-driven field, right? So it's our ethical responsibility to use data-driven decisions to provide the best care for our patients. Guess what failure is? Data. Failure is data. It's not subjective. It's not uncomfortable feelings. It's what I tried didn't work. And with some of our more complex learners, knowing what doesn't work is just as important, if not more important, than knowing what does. And it's a journey to get there. Failure is data. You have successfully ruled out that these materials or this treatment approach or this treatment strategy or this implementation or this setup or this game was not successful.
Yeah.
That means that you're going to be able to take that information, tweak it, and try it again. This is what evidence-based practice is. So if you are feeling like someone had a perfect session, what does that even mean? That's not even a thing. Because
the
the
person
person
flying around the room as they took this picture.
Yeah, and failure is data. You can't do your jobs without understanding the difference between what is successful and what is not successful. I literally chant myself, failure is data, when I'm like burning the recipe that I just tried to make. For me, it was somebody, whoever it was that said that to me, was like a life-changing perspective.
Yeah. And do you want to know where I think this all stems from?
Where?
The grad school application process, because failure is not accepted there.
Oh, interesting. Yep.
C is not accepted. Meanwhile, that C could have been from someone who was taking care of 14 people in their family while also trying to be in class. And I think that whole part of, oh, I failed, that's not good, I'm bad, I'm not good enough, kind of starts stemming from we step into graduate school and they're like, yeah, don't fail. You have to be good at everything. You have to excel in everything. You have to always be on. You have to be the most perfect student.
No.
And it kind of breeds us to think that we always have to prove why we deserve a seat at the table. You already did that if you got accepted into a school. You already proved why you deserve to be here. And I think that's why graduate students then turn to CFs, then turn SLPs, have this huge fear of failure. And
then burnout. Burnout's a huge
problem.
They're
burnt out before they even get their Cs. And I'm just like, it is okay to fail. We need to make mistakes. I think because we are so scared of making mistakes, we then don't advocate for ourselves.
Absolutely true.
More support.
That's absolutely true. And part of the learning process is being vulnerable and making mistakes. You can't learn. You don't have anything to learn because you already know everything. Then what are you doing here? Also, your ego is so big, it's taking up the room. Please leave. That's not, no.
And I forgot exactly where I was going with this, but yeah, the perfectionism standard is never going to be reached. And for a profession that's built on advocacy and support and equal playing grounds for most of our clients, that's what we need to do for our grad students when they're learning, so that they go out, once our grad students feel supported and educated and feel like they can fail and get up again and keep doing better. Once we breed our graduate students to feel like that, they will turn into the most firecracker SLPs, those are the people who are at the IEP meetings where the SLP is like, no, I don't care what you say, this child is getting a device.
Yeah.
Those are
my God.
SLPs.
Yeah. The advocates. And I also think it's funny, we're doing a conference in April of this year. We're trying to focus on leadership for the exact reason that you said. This is a whole conference we're going to do every year on leadership in education and allied health professions. And the theme this year is advocacy, because a lot of times we think of ourselves as SLPs, particularly new grads, as just lucky to have a job, just lucky to be here. We've been broken down and have to build ourselves back up with these new skills. And often we enter our workplaces with tense relationships with our superiors, or afraid of our superiors, or we don't have the skills to negotiate with our superiors. And we have this concept of leadership, that leadership is a position, that leadership is the person with the title after their name who counts your PTO. That's not leadership. That's not what the literature says leadership is. Leadership skills are qualities. These are qualities that you can develop. You can be a leader in that IEP meeting, advocating for your student, challenging the funding sources, challenging your supervisors. You can be a leader by putting effort into creating better relationships with your supervisors. You can be a leader by advocating for your peers or other marginalized groups in your setting. There are so many ways that we can develop leadership skills as people that we just don't talk about.
Yeah.
But they're so important, and it's not necessarily something that we're taught in graduate school. We're just not. And this is, again, another soapbox I could get on for 1,000 years in terms of all the broken systems that we work in, the broken systems that we learn in, and then the broken systems that we are trying to navigate through in terms of creating better working conditions for ourselves, for our peers, better conditions for our clients, for our patients. It's a mess. And we really feel, and this is conversations that we want to keep having, is that talking about these leadership issues and advocacy issues and holding space for that is a really good place to start, so that people feel empowered to make the changes in their own environments, working and within these broken systems from within.
Yeah. And building off of that too, also touching back on why these continuing education courses and everything is so important, is because sometimes we get stuck in graduate school where we have the same professor teaching the same PowerPoint from 5 years ago.
Oh, from 15 or 20 years ago. I had some doozies.
Yeah.
Some doozies.
But that is a prime example of why we ourselves need to continue with our education and continue learning, because that needs to change.
Yes.
The SLPs that have been in schools for the past 40 years who are still doing the same activities they did 20 years ago. Why? Much has changed in our environment, in our society. So many new things have happened that you can make an amazing learning experience for your clients. And I think that the whole kind of just like fear mongering thing where we're just like, we are your superiors, we are your professors, you have to be perfect.
The power differential. It
beats us down. And then we get out of graduate school, like you said, sure, I'll get paid $30 an hour as a CF because you're letting me work, or you're giving me an iPad, something like
that. And shouldn't I be so grateful?
Yeah.
Shouldn't I be so grateful? I'm saying that with sarcasm for anybody listening who can't tell. Shouldn't I be so grateful to be here making a wage that some babysitters make?
Yeah.
It's true. And just for the sake of recapping some of this, when we're talking about quality continuing education, quality professional development after graduate school, how many times we think of it as research, but how many times have you and I mentioned the word research? A couple. There are so many ways that you can improve your professional skills and your clinical skills outside of just knowing the research. Don't get me wrong, knowing the research is important. It's important. But our educational systems, our graduate schools focus so heavily on the research in graduate school that some of these other critically important concepts, like just to name some of the things we talked about, professional humility, professional integrity, leadership, self-advocacy, all of those things we talked about counseling, we talked about ego, we talked about patient-centered care. All of these things are so important for us as professionals. And now that we are having this conversation through the airwaves, I hope all of your listeners take some of that into consideration when they go to choose continuing education for themselves. Please do not just buy another random subscription and make your eyes bleed while you watch a webinar about some research that doesn't apply to your caseload. Yeah. Please do not do that. Do it if you want to. I think that really considering professional development as a multi-sided activity and process is so important, and it will help you prevent burnout. It will help prevent burnout. And there's research on that too, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, and even sitting, and whether it's watching a webinar, listening to a podcast, however you're going to get your continuing education brain smart juice, but it'll make you feel so much better that more, like having more knowledge makes me feel so happy, because I'm like, okay, I can speak on this. I can help my clients. I can talk to my clients' parents and tell them why I'm doing this. And I think that having that education also gives us that soapbox to be able to stand on and say, I know my stuff. I was going to say something else, but I don't know if I could make this explicit, but I know my stuff.
I cursed once in our podcast. It's fine. You'll be fine.
I know my stuff. And it gives you that kind of kick to say, I can take up space. I know what I'm talking about. I am the professional here because I worked at that.
And also, if someone asks you a question, you don't know the answer, I don't know. And that's okay, but I will find out for you. There is a component of trust when you take your expert hat off and you show a little bit of humility and discomfort because you're a human. You can make a human connection with another person, and they will probably listen to you more by saying, you know what, that's a great question. And I don't have an answer for you right now, but let me look it up and get back to you. Those are the people that I hire. Yeah. Those are the marks of a strong clinician, someone who is willing to know what they don't know, the boundaries of their competence, and are willing to move through that with humility and excitement. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. We don't have to be this perfect. It's exactly what you said. We don't have to be perfect to know everything.
Yeah.
We don't. We shouldn't. As a matter of fact, please don't do that. It does not make you attractive to a job.
Yeah.
It does not do any favors to your parents, to your clients, to the families that you work with, to your professionals, or to your superiors. These are not good qualities.
Take perfect out of your vocabulary.
Yes. Say it again.
This is a well-needed conversation that many people need to hear, and I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate this. Because again, we just want to get information out there that's either out there, that's not well known, or just information to motivate people to say, hey, I'm not perfect, and that is okay. I just want everyone to know Kate and I went into this podcast being like, we have some stuff to talk about. We didn't know where we were going, but I'm happy it went this way.
I know, me too. I could talk about these things forever. So I am very grateful that you asked me to be a guest. And if anyone in your audience has questions, please email me.
Yes.
I am an accessible human.
I was gonna say, can you brag about the SLP Nerdcast and what it's all about? Tell everyone about it.
I don't know how comfortable I feel bragging, but I can give you some information.
Yeah,
so
you worked your tush off to get where you were.
We have worked our tushes off. We started SLP Nerdcast about 3 or 4 years ago now, 3 years ago. And after everything that we've just said and identifying all the problems in our field, we really wanted to create a platform where knowledge that was clinically applicable was disseminated freely amongst our profession. And we do this through podcasts. So we were the first ASHA CEU providers. We are ASHA CEU providers because we feel like unfortunately, the vast majority of our field does prefer the ASHA CEU and using the ASHA registry. And we're a business and we have to stay in business. So we are ASHA CE providers, even though you don't have to use the registry and you don't need ASHA CEUs. I always feel like it's a contradiction. We were the first podcast that offered courses for ASHA CEUs. So every single one of our episodes is a course, and we research topics ourselves. We interview lots of researchers, clinicians, and our platform is really focused on accessibility. So our courses are affordable. We have most of our material is open access. So you can get the knowledge for free on your podcast player or on our YouTube channel. And we do have a membership, but the membership is for unlimited ASHA CEUs, but we also have a resource specialist on staff who tries to find donated or purchased therapy materials that are an extension of that research. So remember, with that 17-year research practice gap, our mission is to try and close it as easily as we can and make things as accessible as we can for people. And that's us in a nutshell. We have an agreement with Fitchburg State University, which is a university here in Massachusetts. We offer a couple of more intensive courses for graduate credit for really those individuals who really want to focus on apraxia or really want to focus on evaluating bilingual children. And so we do have some more intensive learning options for grad credit at a university, but for the most part, our stuff is free. We just want people to get the information that they need, and people like free stuff. So it's win-win.
And the SLP Nerdcast podcast is the easiest listening podcast ever. When I listen to when I walk,
that's nice.
Drive. It's great conversations that happen.
Well, thanks, buddy.
Of course. Kate, can you tell us about the fun discounts you have with the SLP Nerdcast?
Yes. So knowing that I was going to come on here today and your audience is likely new in the field or in graduate school, anyone who wants to join our membership can get 10% off with the code SOS, which is obviously an acronym for speaking of semantics. So you can use code SOS to get 10% off the first year of your membership.
Awesome. I highly suggest it. Thank you so much for coming on. I will put everything in the show notes, everything on how to contact Kate and where to find her, where to find the SLP Nerdcast, all that fun stuff. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Of course.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of What the Frickative Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We appreciate that effort as it helps others find the show. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.